My name is Zariah. I was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, and I looked different before I even had a name. My skin was darker than my mother's, marked from birth by a long patch of uneven pigment stretching from the side of my neck to the edge of my left cheek, like smoke curling upward. By the time I was 10, I had started shaving my head myself, because the stairs were easier to manage when I could control something about them. By 13, I had inked the back of my scalp and the side of my temple with patterns that made me feel like I belonged somewhere, anywhere. My mother called it a stain on a stain. My stepfather never called it anything. He just avoided looking me in the face. Every year, when the holidays came around, the house changed. The curtains were washed. The fake gold cutlery came out. The TV stayed on soft jazz. The guest bathroom smelled like lavender and bleach, and I disappeared. They never told me outright, not at first. They'd just wake me earlier than usual and say it was time to get things out of the way. That meant gathering my blankets, my water bottle, sometimes a book if I was lucky, and heading down the narrow stairs to the basement. It was cold down there, not frozen, but heavy. The air always felt like it remembered more than it should. They told me it was only for a little while. Just while the guests are here. Just until dinner ends. Just so no one gets the wrong idea. The wrong idea being that they had a daughter like me. There wasn't a lock on the basement door, not visibly, but once it shut, it didn't open unless they opened it. I tried once, pushing hard when I heard my cousin's voice floating in, from upstairs, hoping someone would hear me, ask about me, remember I existed, but the door didn't budge. After that, I stopped trying. There are types of silence that take root. They grow like mould. You get used to the dark. The walls were unfinished concrete. The floor was uneven and cracked in places. There was a small window near the ceiling, mostly fogged over with dirt, but enough light got in to make the corners less threatening. I made a little space for myself with an old mattress pad, the kind that's too thin to help but too heavy to throw away. I knew which step creaked the loudest. I knew how many minutes it took for the sound of laughter to start above my head. Laughter was the worst part. I didn't mind being alone. I was used to that. But hearing people laugh above me, hearing chairs scrape, glass clink, music hum through, the floor like a pulse, reminded me that I was close enough to touch the world but not welcome in it. They laughed loudly, especially my mother. She had this soft, sugary laugh that she only used when other people were around. It was a sound I hadn't heard directed at me since I was 7. I could tell when dessert was served because the footsteps got faster, lighter. I could tell when the first guests left by the rise and fall of voices near the door. I could tell when someone new arrived by the way the hallway filled with fresh perfume or cigar smoke that seeped through the floorboards. I memorized the rhythm of their joy while sitting on cold concrete with my knees to my chest, tracing invisible shapes on my arms to stay warm. One year, I counted how many times they said my stepbrother's name from upstairs. 15. He got to bring his friends. He got to help serve drinks. He got to stand next to our parents like he was their only child. No one asked where I was. No one paused long enough to wonder about the quiet. Eventually, I learned not to cry. Tears fogged up the little window, made it harder to watch the sky change. Tears made my chest hurt worse than the silence, so I swallowed them. I held them back until they turned into something denser. Not quite rage. Not yet. But something hard, something heavy. They said they did it so no one would be uncomfortable, so I wouldn't be put on the spot. That's how they framed it. Like it was a kindness. Like being erased was better than being seen. And I almost believed it. Because when you hear a lie long enough, it grows roots. It starts to sound like safety. I stopped asking questions after that. I stopped wondering when I would be allowed to sit at the table, or why I didn't get to sign the family cards. I knew the answer. I had known it for a long time. They were ashamed. Not just of how I looked, but of what I reminded them of. A truth too complicated to display. I was the portrait they never hung. The story they didn't tell. The daughter they only acknowledged when the house was empty. But I remembered everything. Every muffled step, every forced laugh, every hour, spent under their joy like it was something I wasn't worthy of. And though I didn't know it yet, that memory would become my foundation, not my wound, my witness. Because one day, someone would ask me what justice looked like, and I'd describe a basement. Underneath the floorboards, the house came alive in a way it never did when it was just us. The footsteps multiplied, the voices softened into politeness, then rose into warm laughter. Glasses clinked, and the oven door opened with that distinct metallic squeal, followed by a wave of roasted meat and sugared citrus. The scent reached even the corners of the basement, clinging to the cold air like a promise I was never meant to taste. My stomach tightened out of reflex, not just hunger but recognition, the kind of hunger that goes beyond food, a hunger to be invited, to belong. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and sat still, careful not to shift the box of Christmas decorations beside me. It wasn't just storage down here, it was a museum of things I wasn't allowed to touch. Silver tinsel, red velvet ribbons, ornaments with names written in cursive gold, my stepbrother's name always perfectly centred, mine missing entirely. I used to think they just forgot. I don't think that anymore. Above me, the dining room chair legs scraped softly against the floor. Then came the lull in conversation that always followed grace. I'd memorised that beat, that pause, the sound of hands folding in reverence and mouths silencing. I used to bow my head too, years ago, in sync with them, even from the basement. Now I stayed still and listened to my mother's voice float down between the cracks. It didn't sound like her regular voice. It had a different rhythm, a smoother, softer tone meant for strangers, for guests, not for me. She was telling someone about my stepbrother, about how proud she was, about his grades, his girlfriend, how he always helped with the turkey. I heard someone ask if they had more kids. The pause after that was long enough to stretch across years, and then she laughed. Not cruelly, just casually, like she was brushing something off her shoulder. She said, "Let them think we have one. Let them think we have one." The words slid through the floor like poison, slow and deliberate. I didn't cry when I heard them. I just blinked and stared at the wooden beam across from me. Let them think we have one. It rang like truth, like confirmation, like a verdict I wasn't allowed to appeal. I pressed my hand into the blanket and clenched my jaw until my teeth ached, not because I wanted to scream, because I wanted to vanish, completely, so they wouldn't have to lie. I used to pretend she loved me, that all of this was a misunderstanding, that if I behaved better, dressed differently, spoke less, did more, they'd eventually let me back upstairs. That the basement was temporary. But that night, listening to her disown me in the most elegant way possible, something inside me stopped waiting. The warmth I'd kept lit somewhere in the back of my chest, hoping, wishing, trying to understand, finally went out. I stayed awake for hours after the voices faded, after the plates had been cleared and the chairs pushed in, after the last set of heels clicked toward the front door and the porch light buzzed into silence. I waited to hear the latch above the basement stair click open. I waited for her to call my name like she sometimes did, with that sigh that sounded like obligation, but she didn't come. They left the door closed that night, whether by accident or choice I'll never know. The house above me stayed quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional pop of the heating pipes. I laid down on the blanket, still wrapped tight around me, and tried not to imagine the tree lights twinkling, without me, the photos being taken, the presents being opened. I tried not to wonder if there was ever a moment she thought about me down there, sitting, breathing, listening. I started counting again, not hours or footsteps, but questions. How long can someone go unseen before they disappear? How many ways can you bury a child without digging? How loud do you have to scream inside your own mind before someone hears it? I didn't have answers then. I just had cold feet and a silence that had learned to hold me like a second skin. By the time morning came, I was still awake. I didn't feel rested. I felt changed. Not stronger, not wiser, just different. Something had calcified overnight. Not armour exactly, just the early signs of it. The shift from asking why to deciding how I would leave, how I would survive. How I would make this version of myself into someone who didn't flinch at the sound of celebration above her head. I didn't know yet what that would look like, but I knew it would not include waiting at the bottom of the stairs for a mother who never came. At 15, I began trying to erase myself in quiet, careful ways. Not out of rebellion, not even out of pain, just out of exhaustion. I was tired of the stares, tired of the way people's expressions shifted when they looked at me for more than a second. Tired of the murmur that followed me into every hallway, every store, every classroom. There was no hiding the unevenness of my skin, the dark mark that crept like a stain up the side of my neck. No concealer stayed on long enough. No scarf covered the right places without making me feel like I was choking. But still, I tried. Stole makeup from the drugstore at first. Nothing expensive. Just the kind of foundation that clings like paste and promises miracles it doesn't deliver. I would stand in front of the mirror before school and smear layer after layer onto my face until my skin felt heavy, like it belonged to someone else. I thought if I could smooth out the texture, even the tone, hide the contrast that made people squint when they saw me, then maybe, just maybe, I could pass. Not be liked, not be seen as beautiful, just not be seen as wrong. It never worked. The foundation cracked by second period, clung to the edges of the mark like it was circling the enemy. I started wearing high collars, even in the heat, long sleeves, that stuck to my arms and made me sweat through the fabric. I kept my chin low, my hairline hidden under beanies even in spring, my eyes to the floor. I spoke less. I answered in nods. I sat in the back. I trained my body to take up as little space as possible, to make myself smaller not through disappearance but through erasure. By then, the whispers weren't just at school, they were everywhere. At church, old women would press their lips together when I passed. In the supermarket, children asked out loud what was wrong with my face while their mothers shushed them too late. I learned to pretend I didn't hear. I became skilled at pretending to focus on my phone, pretending to be listening to music, pretending to be somewhere else entirely. Even at home, the pretending never stopped. My mother had given up scolding me about the tattoos I drew in pen across my wrists when no one was watching. She had stopped trying to talk to me in the mornings, as if I might infect the rest of her day with whatever ugliness she saw in me. We passed each other, in the hallway like strangers avoiding collision. Her eyes flicked across my face only when she thought I wasn't looking. That kind of glance, quick, calculated, full of disappointment, burns deeper than a slap. I started to think that if I could just be blank, I could be safe. That the less of myself I showed, the less they'd have to hide. The less they'd need to apologise for me, cover me, remove me from rooms. I wanted to be the kind of invisible that didn't hurt, but I learned there is no such thing. Even invisibility carries weight. It bruises in its own way. At 15, while other girls were curling their lashes and choosing lip gloss colours, I was memorising lighting angles. I knew which mirrors in the house warped my face less. I knew how to stand so the shadows fell, in the right place. I practised breathing quietly. I stopped laughing out loud. I thought if I could muffle every sign of myself, I could buy some form of acceptance, even if it was empty. Sometimes I imagined what it would be like to walk through the world without being looked at like a warning. I didn't dream of being beautiful. I dreamed of being plain, of being boring, of blending in, of walking through a crowd and not hearing silence drop like a stone as people noticed me. I thought if I worked hard enough at it, if I mastered the makeup, the posture, the silence, then I could reach that kind of peace. But no amount of product could make people forget. They didn't just see my skin. They saw the story they'd already written for me, one of shame, of danger, of punishment. And I carried it for them for years, without ever agreeing to. The truth was, I didn't want to disappear because I hated myself. I wanted to disappear because I was tired of being a mirror for other people's disgust. Tired of being the reason someone averted their eyes. Tired of mothers pulling their children closer when I passed by. Tired of hearing my name whispered. Like a warning, so I erased myself in layers. One expression at a time, one shrug, one ducked head, one missed photo, one deleted message. I wore the erasure like a second skin, and I got good at it. So good, in fact, that I stopped remembering what my real face looked like. The bare one, the one that didn't hide. But the worst part wasn't what they saw. It was what they taught me to do before they even looked. They trained me to vanish before they ever had to ask. And for a while I let them. After I ran away, I started sleeping in basements that looked just like the one they used to lock me in. But now, every choice I made was mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had escaped one kind of darkness only to choose another, but this time it didn't carry their voices. No one whispered above my head. No one decided when I came up. The walls were still cold, the air still smelled like dust and rusted pipes, but it was my silence now. And that made all the difference. I left the house just after midnight. No note, no shoes, just a backpack and the kind of resolve that doesn't ask for permission. The street was slick with summer rain, and I walked fast without a plan, counting the seconds between footsteps to keep my heart steady. I knew I couldn't go back, not even to collect the few things I owned. I didn't want anything that had rested under that roof. I wanted distance. I wanted air. I wanted to know what it felt like to be cold because of the weather, and not because someone had locked the door. The first night I found shelter behind a church. There was a door to the cellar left slightly cracked, and I slipped in like a breath held too long. The cement floor was uneven, the room stacked with forgotten folding chairs and dusty hymnals. I curled into myself beside the water heater and waited for sleep that didn't come. Instead, I made lists in my head. Not of regrets, but of things I would never do again. I would never apologize for being seen. I would never wear beige to blend. I would never ask someone to call me beautiful just to make the silence easier. For weeks I drifted. Basement to garage, garage to boiler room. Anywhere with a roof that didn't ask questions. I became a ghost by necessity, not shame. I learned which corner stores didn't mind if you loitered, which trains ran late with empty cars. I shared benches with other kids who had fled different prisons, different names, different chains. We didn't talk much, but we nodded. The kind of nod that says, I see your edges, you're not alone. Food came when it did. Most nights it didn't. Hunger wasn't new. What was new was eating without watching someone's face tighten across the table. I felt invisible, but in a way that made space instead of erasing it. And little by little, I began to reclaim my body. I didn't cover the mark on my skin anymore. I didn't hide the ink or the piercings. I looked at myself in the reflection of train windows and thought, this is what survival looks like. Not pretty, not polished, but mine. Some nights I walked past houses lit up for holidays. I could hear the clatter of forks, the hum of laughter through the windows, and it stabbed something soft in me. Not envy, something older. Memory, maybe. Of the girl beneath the floorboards, the one who listened to joy like it was a language she would never learn. But now I stood on the sidewalk. I wasn't locked away. No one controlled my silence anymore. I could walk on. I could choose not to listen. There were moments I thought about going back, not to live, but to confront, to ask them why, to stand, in the middle of the kitchen and say, here I am, whole, awake, not what you made me. But I knew they wouldn't understand. They would see rebellion, disrespect. They would try to fold me back into the version of myself they could stomach. And I had already burned that version to the ground. I got a job sweeping floors at a tattoo shop. They didn't care what I looked like. The owner nodded at my sleeves and said, looks like you earned it. I didn't smile, but something in my chest lifted. There, I was just Zariah. Not a ghost, not a warning, not the daughter you keep in the shadows. Just a girl with calloused hands and sharp eyes who showed up on time and did the work. I slept in the back storage room some nights. It was small and smelled like ink and rubbing alcohol, but it was warm. The first time I fell asleep there, I dreamed of nothing. Not basements, not holidays, not her face, just dark, uninterrupted space. And when I woke, I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I just got up, swept the floor, and started again. This wasn't a fairy tale. I didn't find a home. I didn't get a miracle. But I got a door I could open and close on my own. I got quiet without shame. I got through the winter with cracked lips and frozen fingers, but still breathing. And slowly, I started to believe that survival wasn't the absence of pain, but the refusal to be erased by it. The basements I slept in now didn't define me. They sheltered me, but they didn't own me. And every time I closed my eyes on cold concrete, I knew one thing. I was still here, and I would stay. I didn't study law because I believed in it. I studied law because I wanted to become the voice I never had. The first time I stepped into a courtroom, I wasn't there for a case of my own. I was 17 and exhausted, and it was raining. I ducked inside to get warm, sat in the back row on a splintered bench, and ended up watching a girl no older than me stand in front of a judge who never looked her in the eyes. Her lawyer spoke in circles. The prosecutor barely looked at his notes, and she just stood there, shoulders forward, eyes low. I saw myself in the space around her, the absence of defence, the quiet that gets mistaken for guilt, the weight of not having anyone to say, wait, let her speak. After that day, I began haunting law libraries the way some kids haunt arcades. I wasn't enrolled in any program. I had no money, no address, no plan. I just walked in like I belonged and no one stopped me. I sat in corners with used notebooks and borrowed pens, tracing case law I didn't yet understand. I memorized phrases. I copied arguments line by line, not to win anything, but to learn the shape of power, and how people used language like a weapon, while girls like me were taught to swallow every word we ever needed. I didn't believe in justice. I had never seen it. I only believed in the silence I'd carried too long, and the ache it left behind. And I believed that if I could learn how to speak their language, I could use it to say the things I was once punished for even thinking. The idea of being a lawyer didn't feel like a dream. It felt like resistance. It felt like standing still while the world tried to vanish me. I wanted to learn how to enter a room and stay there without shrinking. I wanted to say a sentence and not be dismissed before I finished it. I wanted to put the law in my mouth and make it burn for the people who tried to silence me. At night, I studied wherever I could. Storage rooms, libraries that closed late, the corner of the tattoo shop where they still let me sweep for cash. I built a life out of fragments, assembling knowledge like bricks. I studied court transcripts like sacred texts, underlining every moment where someone was interrupted, ignored, overruled. I didn't just want to know the law. I wanted to know where it bent, where it failed, where it forgot the very people it claimed to protect. Eventually, I applied to a program under a name that no longer belonged to anyone but me. Zariah. No middle name, no prefix, no inherited guilt. Just the one name I had carried through basements and alleyways, through hunger and heat, through silence and survival. When the acceptance email came, I stared at it for hours. Not because I doubted I belonged, but because for the first time someone said yes without knowing who they were saying it to. Law school was not kind. It wasn't designed for people, like me, people with visible scars and loud silence. I was watched, measured, doubted. Professors read my name like it was a mistake in their mouth. Classmates spoke over me, around me, through me, but I had already lived worse. I had already survived the kind of isolation they couldn't imagine. So I stayed. I studied harder. I learned to speak like them, and then sharper. I didn't echo their tone. I sharpened mine until it cut through their noise. I didn't become a lawyer to wear the suit or pass the bar or hang a certificate. I did it because somewhere in the world there was another girl sitting in the back of a courtroom, wearing silence like it was the only outfit she owned. I did it because I remembered what it felt like to scream with your mouth closed, to wait for rescue that never came. I became a voice not for justice, but for interruption, for correction, for truth spoken in a tone that couldn't be dismissed. Now, I walk into courtrooms where people still look twice. Not because of shame, but because I make them. Because I have learned that power is not given, it's spoken. Clearly, calmly, again and again, until the echo finally reaches the places where I was once hidden. And every time I rise to speak, I remember the basement. I remember the girl who wasn't invited to the table, and I speak as if she still can't. When I first presented a case in court, the prosecutor asked what drove me to do this work. I held up a photo of the door I spent, my childhood behind. It was a small, grainy printout, edges worn from being folded too many times. A basement door, peeling white paint, a brass knob dulled by years of fingerprints that never reached for me. To most people, it was nothing. A storage closet, a utility space. But to me, it was a sentence, a beginning, a shape I had memorized, in the dark. I didn't explain it. I just held it up, steady and silent, and waited until he looked away. That case was a small one. A housing rights issue, tenant displacement, nothing high profile. But to the woman I represented, it was everything. She was being pushed out of a building she'd lived in for 20 years because a new developer wanted to turn it into condos. They told her she didn't belong, that her life, her memories, her roots, none of it mattered against the weight of paperwork and profit. When I stood beside her that day, I realised I wasn't just arguing a lease. I was arguing identity, presence, the right to remain visible in a world that is always trying to cover you. I didn't wear anything new to court. I wore what made me feel most like myself. My tattoos showed beneath the sleeves of my jacket. The scar on my neck wasn't covered. My hair was shaved clean, lined sharp. I didn't soften myself for their comfort. I didn't bend my tone. I spoke clearly, plainly, and when I was asked why I cared so deeply, why this mattered to me, I didn't give them the usual lines. I didn't recite my education or quote case law. I pulled the photo from my folder, held it chest high, and let it speak the thing I couldn't yet say out loud, that once I had lived on the other side of a door built to hide me. The courtroom went still. Not out of shock, but confusion. They didn't understand what they were looking at. It didn't matter. It wasn't for them. It was for me. For her. For every client I would ever defend who had been told they were better left unseen. After that day, I kept the photo in my case file, not as a symbol, not as a wound, as proof. That no matter how far I walked from that place, I still carried its memory not as weight, but as direction. It reminded me that I never wanted to sit in a room where decisions were made and not be able to speak. We won the case. Not because of the picture, but because I refused to disappear, because I asked the right questions, because I framed the facts not as technicalities, but as realities lived in skin and breath. Afterward, the client hugged me with both arms, not out of gratitude but recognition. She didn't ask about the photo, she didn't need to. Some truths don't need translation. That night, I went home and stood in front of my mirror longer than usual. I looked at myself not to critique, not to adjust, but to see, to really see. The face I used to cover, the marks I used to hide. The eyes that had learned how to hold fury without burning. I whispered thank you, not to myself, but to the silence that had once swallowed me whole, and to the voice that now stood in its place. It would not be the last time I showed that photo, but it would be the first time I knew exactly who I was when I did. At one of the hearings, I saw my mother sitting in the audience, wearing the same dress she used to wear when she closed the kitchen door behind her. It was pale blue with small white flowers, the kind of fabric that wrinkles at the elbows and softens with years of use. I hadn't seen that dress in over a decade, but the memory of it struck me like a cold hand around the throat. I used to watch the hem of it swing gently as she moved around the house, avoiding my gaze, stepping over the places I sat. She was seated quietly, hands clasped in her lap, her face still and unreadable. She looked older, not just in age, but in posture. Like something had bent her in places that had never been straightened again. The courtroom was already half full when I noticed her, and I don't know how long she'd been there. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't smile. She didn't shift. Just sat and watched, as if I were part of some slow disaster she couldn't look away from. I don't know what I expected to feel. Maybe anger, maybe panic, maybe that pull in the chest that still whispers daughter when you least expect it. But what I felt was silence. That old, thick silence that used to live between us, now stretched across a larger room. It was familiar, but it no longer had power. I took my place at the table without a tremor. I opened my file, straightened, my papers, adjusted my jacket. My voice didn't shake when I introduced myself. My hands didn't falter when I stood. The hearing wasn't remarkable, a procedural matter, more paperwork than performance. But I found myself speaking slower, with more intention. I knew her ears were catching every word. I knew she was hearing. My name spoken aloud by someone else, by court clerks, by judges, by clients who trusted me. The name she once said with exhaustion, with hesitation, with a guilt she never owned. That name now held weight. It filled the room. It didn't. Ask for her approval. As I spoke, my eyes moved across the courtroom, but I never looked directly at her. I didn't need to. Her presence wasn't a test. It wasn't a reunion. It was a witness. And for once, I wasn't the one on trial. I was standing upright, grounded in a place she never imagined I'd reach. And certainly not on my own terms. I remembered her back turned to me in the kitchen, the way she used to hum when the door was closed and the guests were laughing. I remembered her voice through the basement ceiling, light and lovely for everyone but me. And now, here she was, dressed in the past like it could undo what it had done. But I wasn't 12. I wasn't waiting to be let out. I wasn't begging to be included. I was here because I had earned the right to be seen, and nothing she wore could reverse that. When the session ended, I gathered my things slowly. I felt her eyes follow me, felt them hold longer than they used to, but still she said nothing. She didn't stand. She didn't move. Just watched. Maybe she came looking for the girl she left behind. Maybe she stayed to see if I'd acknowledge her. But I didn't. Not out of cruelty. Not out of vengeance. But because the woman I had become didn't owe anything to the silence that raised her. Outside, the wind was sharp and the sun low. I stood on the steps of the courthouse and breathed, in air that no longer smelled like cellars or secrets. The city moved around me, indifferent and alive. I was no longer hiding in corners. I was the one opening doors now, and inside, she was still sitting, still watching. But I was already gone. Now I read the verdicts aloud to the very kind of people who once said I was better off unseen, and I do it with my face uncovered. No foundation, no apologies, no lowered gaze. I stand beneath the fluorescent lights of the courtroom with the same posture I once used to brace against insults, only now it holds me steady, not small. My voice doesn't tremble, it doesn't beg, it delivers, clear, deliberate, unafraid. There is a moment in every courtroom, just before I speak, when everything stills. Pages stop turning. Pens lift off notepads. Breath holds in the spaces between the ribs. It's the moment that used to be filled by other people, people in suits, people with last names that opened doors mine never could. Now it's mine. I've earned that silence, and I fill it without flinching. Sometimes the defendants stare. Sometimes they laugh, nervous, dismissive, unready, but they always listen, because what I say matters now, because my presence has been shaped not by acceptance, but by persistence. I didn't become powerful because they allowed it. I became powerful because I stopped asking. Every word I speak stands on the shoulders of the girl who once sat beneath floorboards, tracing invisible lines in the concrete to pass the time. I've represented clients who haven't been touched in years except by handcuffs. I've stood beside women whose names were never written on birthday cakes. I've defended men who forgot what it meant to speak in complete sentences because the world only ever demanded their silence. And every time, I remember that I'm not their saviour. I'm their translator, their echo. the shape their stories take when someone refuses to let them be erased. I no longer dream of proving anything. Not to them, not to her, not even to the parts of myself that still wake up sometimes, expecting the sound of a lock sliding into place. I don't need permission to exist in full view. I don't need applause. I don't even need understanding. I need truth, and I need the kind of justice that doesn't fit neatly into verdicts, but still leaves a mark. I return to my hometown. Sometimes. Not often. Just enough to remind myself of the distance between what was and what is. I pass the street I grew up on. The house still stands, smaller now, shrinking under the weight of its own silence. I never go inside. I don't need to. I've already walked out for good. And every courtroom I step into is another room she'll never close behind me. I still carry the photo, the door, the proof. I still hear the things they said. The way they said them, the flatness, the certainty, as if I were a stain that could be scrubbed clean. Now, when I hear that same tone in someone else's voice, I know what to do with it. I don't absorb it. I name it. I meet it head on. I wrap language around it like rope and pull it into the light. This work isn't neat. It isn't beautiful. It doesn't end with a bow. But every time I read a closing statement, every time I place evidence on a table and say, look, this matters, I reclaim another piece of what they tried to bury, and I do it with my face uncovered. Not despite the marks, not despite the stares. But because I no longer belong to the rooms that needed me hidden, I belong exactly where I stand, and I'm not going anywhere.